Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Season 1, Episode 3 of The Lucky Man, Stan Lee's Lucky Man. So, going into this show, I immediately am still just kind of like, okay, like going back into it, just really talking about it, and just ultimately, I was like, yeah, I kind of forgot about this show because I had so many other things to do, so many stuff that I wanted to get into and review. Then ultimately, I was just kind of scrolling through like all the videos of all that I've already done, just to kind of see what rung of which like things are at, and it seemed at least, yeah, that it seemed that the reviews of these were going okay. So I was like, I guess I'll go back into this, and like I wonder what the fascination is about this show, because ultimately now you could no longer go into this and watch this via Shutter. More than likely, there is also Amazon like subscriptions that you can go into and watch this show. But I would also say go into probably there's movie apps that you can probably dare in fact watch this show and enjoy it. You could probably go into a movie pro or a movie play box and ultimately watch this through that. Reasonably, it might take some interesting ways of which to ultimately search for it, but it's there, and you can watch the entire first season and or more if you haven't caught this show yet. Ultimately, if you haven't also caught this review since now, ultimately you can, because maybe you're a new subscriber or new whatever, uh, a new viewer, definitely go into the playlist, which I already have, that can showcase episode one and make you very interested in maybe quite possibly finding this show and watching it, or even buying the seasons or anything like that. So, going into this episode, I thought that this episode was quasi interesting. It's kind of much more kind of like a transitional episode, to be brutally honest, because it's kind of showing that Harry is kind of protecting his coworkers, and it's really kind of an episode that doesn't have much to do uh, with Gray in this episode. Really, we just have Harry just kind of doing his own thing that is otherwise tied to the men that tend to come after him in motorcycle esh-like gear at some points in times. So within here, we have to be very much a kind of an escalation of telling us that that it seems that Harry's boss really does not like him to the point of him uh, really needing to keep Harry on a very tight leash and not having him do business upon his own, having to forcibly be otherwise tied with a partner, even though his partner is out on leave because she is, I guess, emotionally compromised and ultimately needing time off. So, going into this, we have Harry otherwise tied with Orwell, and reasonably, you kind of have Harry and Orwell kind of doing their own thing, but then eventually, when Orwell is probably going to get ambushed or probably get in trouble, you have Harry that is, of course, doing the decent thing and trying to protect him. So going into the episode, evidently for within the last episode, if you guys didn't know, we had Ben die within the very last portion of episode. So really now we are otherwise kind of having the aftermath of that. We were kind of mourning his loss with a lot of his coworkers, yada yada yada. So let's ultimately kind of break down and ultimately talk about this episode. Let's kind of talk about it in spoilers, because this probably episode is probably fairly much simpler than a lot of others. uh, because really it's just kind of a transitional episode to kind of keep things interesting. But then again, it's really just to say, hey, like we didn't have much going on in this episode, so we just invented this story to kind of tell a little bit of things here and there, but ultimately tell you that, of course, Harry can't really be otherwise tied to Gray right now because ultimately we have Anna, who ultimately is otherwise taking the case of Gray and ultimately being his lawyer, which is, of course, pushing Harry to where, of course, he cannot be involved in this case right now. He has to be involved in some other case, which ends up being a seemingly diamond-like case, which is kind of the go-to, like, it's either like a robbery or it has something to do with money, or at some points you have a story about diamonds. So, let's go into this episode. Let's talk about spoilers because at the end of the day, yeah, I just kind of find this show interesting, and eventually I can't wait till I get past the first season and on to probably more seasons, or maybe just a more interesting story that otherwise eventually ties in certain characters and this and that, whichever would have you. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this episode. So in the very beginning of this, we have a old man who is trying to tell, I believe, Blake. I want to say Blake, I believe, that ultimately he has a diamond to sell him. And so reasonably, this old man who is a jeweler is trying to uh, sell off this perfectly cut diamond, and reasonably this guy is not believing it. So ultimately, this guy is in desperation to try to sell this diamond, and so reasonably we seemingly have it to where one old man is this old man who is trying to sell this diamond which he didn't have to Blake ultimately is going to force the guys with otherwise motorcycle helmets on uh, to go after and try to rob the brother of this man who was offering to sell off this diamond. They were trying to get the information of where this diamond was, and so reasonably they end up robbing this of course jewelry store, and they end up trying to torture this guy trying to get this information because they were peeling off his fingers, his fingernails, to try to ask where the diamonds were, because ultimately they weren't going to go through this guy that didn't have the diamond on him. They were going for his brother that ultimately had the diamond, and ultimately they wanted to know where it was. So reasonably we have within this episode that that Harry and Surrey are trying to do this case because they can't actually do the Gray case because ultimately Anna is a part of that case. And Harry is consistently telling like Surrey that she needs to go home or she needs to take time off. And that ultimately like her being in love with Ben and having to watch him die next to her, like that's like Harry's is desperately telling Surrey to go home and take some time off, and Surrey's like, "No, I'll be fine." Like, "No, I'm sure I'll be fine." Even when she sees this dead body, this old man, like Harry's just like, "Are you okay?" And Surrey's like, "Yeah, I'm fine." Ultimately pushing for her boss, Detective um, Superintendent Winter, ultimately telling like Winter telling Surrey, it's like you need to take time off. Like like we're gonna let you take time off, so you're going to do it. Like I order you to go home and take time off, like because everybody is really having a hard time like working through this loss, and you were the one that was there um, when he had died, so you are taking time off. So Suri eventually leaves, pushing to where Winter is telling Harry that it's like, hey, I'm not going to just let you do a case on your own. You're going to work with Orwell, and you two are going to work together on this case. Which ultimately, that's not even close to what they do. We ultimately seemingly have Harry, who, when is walking outside of this after he notices the dead body and is looking through the outside of this building, ultimately noticing some rabbi who is doing this kind of a ritual to. Uh, and so seemingly we have Harry running off to kind of ask this rabbi, like, hey, are you familiar with the guy who had died? Ultimately asking him a couple questions, but the rabbi isn't going to really talk or release any information. He's ultimately just like, well, hey, make a schedule with my assistant, and then I will get back to you, which ultimately he does. So, and that's when eventually Harry has to forcibly work with Orwell, and so reasonably, Doug, who is the mortician, ultimately notices that the fingernails were being ripped off, and ultimately telling us that this old man was actually being tortured. And so Harry is like, interesting. And so reasonably, it ends up being that Harry is trying to figure out, like, why is it that this person was being tortured. It seemed that ultimately this guy who was killed and his brother were ultimately having to have had a kerfuffle or a kind of back and forth bargaining about this whole diamond and how to get rid of it or how to sell it, this cut diamond. And so, reasonably, Harry eventually has to talk to the son of the other brother because the other brother had also seemingly gotten beat up and uh, been uh, been thrown into a hospital as well to kind of keep him on the hush and hush. And so we have it to where, excuse me, we have it to where we have it to where Harry is asking this son of this brother. It's like, well, hey, like, what is it that these guys are otherwise coming after these men for? And really, the bargaining or the debate was about this cut diamond. And so reasonably, the brother tells exactly where this cut diamond was, and so Harry has to go and try to find where that is. So while after uh, while after Harry had talked to this rabbi trying to get some information, and while also Orwell had gotten some information as well from this rabbi, because we have to do this investigation twice to just kind of just have Orwell do different things than Harry does. So it ends up that Orwell is on his way to finding this cut diamond, and while Orwell is going to also find the cut diamond, he is also going to find some motorcycle heads while going there. And we have to where ultimately Harry is now going to have to save Orwell because he knows that Orwell is heading into an ambush. So here's also the things that is also going on in this episode. Anna is ultimately wanting to talk to her client, which is Gray, or what we are to assume is Gray, because it seems like this guy is willing to confess and mention that he did all these murders and all these killings and all these whatevers, and say that he is Gray. And ultimately, he is in jail, and supposedly someone had snuck into his jail cell a seemingly device that he could that Gray could use uh, to slice his throat and kill his own self. So we have it to where Anna is just kind of waiting for a very long time to be able to talk to her client, because ultimately she had talked to him earlier, but now she wants to talk to him again. It seems like she's waiting forever to talk to this client. Ultimately, she's asking, it's like, hey, like, dude, I've been waiting here for like 20 minutes. Where is this guy? And so immediately we eventually find out that this prisoner had took his own life. You ultimately have it to where Anna is now very suspicious of this prison, and she is going to Julian and asking him, it's like, hey, like, why is it that all of a sudden this guy had like self-harm tendencies and stuff like that? Like, how is it that all of a sudden this guy was fine until he got to your prison? And Julian is just kind of telling her whatever she needs to hear, that it's like, oh no, like I don't have people thinking that that they're gonna have self-harm tendencies. If anything, like we're trying to be here to help people and try to rehab them back to rehab them back to health and sanity and this and that. And so Anna's just like, I think you're just kind of telling me whatever I want to hear, kind of thing. So that's what Anna kind of like just kind of drifts off and just kind of leaves and is just frustrated with Julian. So we have it to where Harry is ultimately going and trying to save Orwell, knowing that he is heading to an ambush. And so recently we have it to where Harry is kind of there a little bit too late. We have seemingly the motorcycle gang that is kind of beating up Orwell and otherwise taking him down. Harry is bargaining he's bargaining for Orwell's life to tell these people exactly where the diamond is and offering them this diamond. Funny enough, interestingly enough, we don't have much of the luck that is presented within this episode. But Harry is able to clothesline one of the motorcyclists when they were trying to beat up that other brother and try to get information out of him, which Harry was tailing this guy and led to the motorcycle gang beating this other older brother up, and Harry was trying to tail him. And ultimately, we also found out that because Shuri was going to the roulette wheel, and we ultimately have uh, uh, Lillian Liu, or no wait, crap. Yeah, we ultimately, I believe it's Lillian Liu who ultimately is uh, is talking to Suri because ultimately she is the casino owner of this establishment, and ultimately her father had died, and so ultimately Lillian is ultimately talking to Suri and mentioning it's like how ultimately that this casino might uh, really be in the favor of some police officers getting really rich in this casino at some points. Because ultimately, Suri is figuring out that it seems that some portions of this casino is actually rigged for people to win at some point, and ultimately, Suri realizes that the roulette wheel was actually rigged, and is calling Harry to let him know that the roulette wheel was rigged. And Harry's like, "Oh my god, well, like I won like a ton of money off of that roulette wheel." And so yeah, so maybe they were uh maybe Harry was thinking that is like, "Oh crap, I guess that was their variation of some kind of payoff for me." But anyways, so going on in the very tail end of this, like Harry, yeah, he ends up giving the diamond to the motorcycle gang to keep Orwell alive, and that's kind of justifiably how this episode quasi ends out. Uh, we also eventually, I think, have uh, Eve also show up within this episode through points in here because really Harry needs to ask her like what does she mean when ultimately Harry is the good luck that he gets is going to affect other people, and Eve can't quite really answer that, and but he's like frustratingly asking throughout this episode, and eventually tail endingly later Eve will come and be one of these motorcycle-ish like people that ultimately is going to save Harry from getting beaten up by this motorcycle-ish like gang, I believe in the either at the tail end of this episode or the very next episode. So we also had Harry try to get the bracelet off in this episode, talking to his brother, and like his brother was ultimately having some like kind of like saw to cut metal, and Harry was asking Rich. He was like, "Hey, like, how much do you know about how to do stuff with this saw?" And Rich like bejokingly mentions is like, "Oh yeah, I just watched a YouTube video of a tutorial of this saw while you were in the loo." And Harry's like, "What?" He's like, "Dude, you're gonna be fine." So Rich tries to use this saw to cut this bracelet, and it doesn't work. The like it gets to the point where the saw ends up completely breaking, and parts of it end up flinging upon a wall. Where luckily, it narrowly misses Rich's assistant. So really there is no way to get this bracelet off. There's no real way to test what it is, but ultimately it seems that bizarrely they found the one person in the world that seems to know the entire backstory about this bracelet weirdly. And like now we have some like historian that knows everything about this bracelet, and but then again Harry doesn't know quite enough about it, hence why going to Eve and asking about the whole luck thing. On the more luck that he gets, the more that it might be on someone else's downfall. So reasonably, yeah, that is all that is really kind of going on within this episode. I kind of backed around things and kind of like told the big story, and then kind of went back and backpedaled for some of the side things that happened in this episode. Recently, there is some like again, this is kind of like a transitional story or kind of like a filler episode to get little smaller stories out of the way to eventually have the very probably next episode uh, tying into much bigger things. So recently, that's all I could say about this episode. I thought that really there was either stuff kind of conveniently happening in this episode a lot, uh, not on Harry's terms, but like on everything else. Like everything was a little too easy, or everything was a little bit too like oh yeah, of course they would go this route because normally you'd always go to this kind of route at some point. So going into this, I think that's all I have to say about this episode. That's all I have to say about this review, and yeah, that's all I'm going to say for this one. Um, yeah, there's really like I've watched this entire first season, and I hope that eventually I can uh, really just not go into it and just be like, yeah, what a clunky episode and this and that. But like, really, I know how shows at some point are like done, where there's some episodes where not all of them are going to be home runs, but if anything, I liked the fact that we got like another episode where we keep tying on certain characters like Anna, or we have it to where Winter is kind of really escalating with Harry, kind of telling Harry that he doesn't trust him, and that ultimately he like there basically is going to be like an internal investigation on Harry because he just like there is no trust there, and ultimately he's like really going to like have this guy if he's forcibly having to work on his own, that ultimately he's better off just kind of sitting at home until he gets a partner, which I thought was interesting. So anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Ultimately, a very quick and brief review, but really, this one was kind of a much more filler episode. But anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.